Now, we then move to the next part of this one, I'll share this. I will share the start of it, and Jordi will take over. But I'll share in the beginning because he's the first speaker. As I said before, it will be focusing very much on the kickoff meeting. The support part has not yet evolved just because of time. We start seeing the first advices coming in as a consequence of milestones agreed at kickoff meetings, but that's really only where we are. But Jordi, you've agreed to summarize the regulatory experience so far. Then we have two presentations, and I'd like to thank for those from two individual companies that's been through this part. And then we have again, as Jordi said earlier, a summary of the experience from the EFPIA perspective. So thanks for all that.
Thank you, Thomas. I'll try to present really what Thomas said about, okay, how do we see so far that we have delivered on Prime in what we can deliver in 1 year? And before that, I have to say that I'm presenting this, but in this presentation, again, I've been working with Zara a lot. So this is basically a 50-50, I mean, being generous with me, effort. So what we had there, you know this slide, that was presented when we were launching the Prime scheme. What was there on offer, I would say, to companies applying to Prime? We said, okay, this is putting together tools we have, improving interaction with companies, with different stakeholders. So we'll have the written confirmation of Prime in terms of eligibility. Therefore, you have the label. We'll have an early CHMP rapporteur appointment during development. That was, at the time, quite a novel concept. Sometimes challenged, but I think we have managed. We would put together a kickoff meeting where we would discuss with different stakeholders, different committees of the agency, what's the plan, what's the status of development, what do we need, where do we need to interact. We would have enhanced scientific advice, an EMEA dedicated contact point, really to channel contact with industry through this entry point, and fee incentives for SMEs and academics on scientific advice requests. We have delivered what we will see. Kickoff meetings, we have so far experience with 15 products. So far, who has been attending those kickoff meetings? Obviously, we had the applicants coming, with all of them there's no kickoff. But look at the rest. It's really quite, I would say, a statement of engagement of the network and effort put together on those discussions. We have had the rapporteur and the assessors joining. Normally, the rapporteur is present in the meeting face-to-face with the company, the assessors teams on the phone. We have had the chairs participating of CAT, so Advanced Therapies Committee, CHMP chairing the meeting, and Scientific Advice chairing the meeting, and also either representatives or chairs also from PDCO, COM, and PRAC. As you can see, I mean, you cannot ask for more, basically, in terms of engagement. And really my thanks to all the people that have been traveling to London, 1 day before CHMP or doing scientific advice to participate to the meeting. And of course, you have had their EMEA support. The idea here is to have a global view of the status of development and the next steps of development. And what we have done is that we try to have those meetings as early as possible. I mean, in fact, now the range that we have, basically, on average, we have the meetings 4 months after eligibility. We could do it quicker, maybe. I mean, the agendas are busy of those very important people. Industry also has to do a bit of work. So we know that there's a stress, but we push as much as we can so the meetings happen as soon as possible. Because also we don't have a lot of time to waste for those products if they are really innovative products. So we have to really keep the ball rolling. We do always the meetings in the margins of the CAT or the CHMP meetings, out of, again, making things easy for the people that are involved. And finding an optimal timing is not always easy, particularly when there's an ongoing scientific advice procedure. That has happened sometimes. We have a struggle with that because we have a bit of, I would say, contamination between the two dialogues. One rather formal with scientific advice with an outcome letter, and the other one, the kickoff meeting, where we discuss sometimes beyond that. And sometimes we need the input from the scientific advice to have a proper discussion in the kickoff. So these are really complex situations, but we are working on that. We are even thinking about having sometimes kickoffs in the margins of the scientific advice. We will see. As you can see, we are thinking to improve the system. And how do we do that? Well, we ask companies to provide briefing document about 3-4 weeks in advance, so we can have a look really at the document, and we tailor the agenda based on that. So that's important to understand. It's not purely an administrative point that we need something to start the kickoff. Really, we go through, and the assessors go through the document. We have a prep TC with them, and then we tailor the meeting according to the needs of that product. That's the individual approach of that development, individual approach of the future advice that we will give there. And that has been happening with all kickoffs. And what we have been doing there on these 15 meetings we have had, well, we had a broad discussion on development and the regulatory strategy. That, I think, is very important, because there we are really flagging what, from the experience of that very senior people from the network, from the agency, what are probably the hurdles that you'll have in order to have an accelerated assessment. We have identified many issues that have to be then channeled to the scientific advice, because in the kickoff meeting we are not giving advice on issues. We can discuss, we can go through data, go a bit in depth, but this is not the point of the kickoff meeting. The kickoff meeting is held then to establish then how the product will be taken forward later. We have raised awareness on the planning of post-authorization aspects and HTA interactions, and we agree on future interactions. You see those 2 stars there, because that was very importantly felt initially, and we don't think we have delivered fully on that. There's still a lot that we need to push in terms of having fruitful discussion on post-marketing authorization data generation. Here I would focus on those products that are closer to submission, but sometimes this is important also even for products that are earlier in development, because those marketing authorizations sometimes will depend on those data generations later on. So that is really an important point. And that, to be honest with you, is my impression. Industry has been a bit reluctant sometimes. I think here we need to shift a bit the way we work and try to really put more emphasis on those post-marketing authorization data generation. And again, on future interactions, I think we need to also make an effort probably to really have a better follow-up of those interactions, but that's, again, work in progress that we are taking on board. As I said before, one of the, I would say, big advantage of the Prime was the early appointment of the rapporteur. Basically, from development phases, you have identified the person that will lead, well, one of the teams that will lead the assessment of that marketing authorization. That was really something that we wanted to push for. And why? Because we have there an opportunity really to have a continuous knowledge gain on the development of the product for someone that will have this leading role when we assess the product. Of course, by doing that, we are able to identify the relevant expertise and experts that will be needed for that assessment, because we identify the issues early on and then build the adequate team that will be able to really address that. And from our point of view, we have also this opportunity to influence development, influence to the extent that we regulators can do that. But of course, we can trigger those fruitful discussions at the level of scientific advice or other instances where we really comment on what we see from experience and we see from even other products. So far we have had, I mean, we went through the colleagues that have been involved, rapporteurs and different members of committees, and we have had very good feedback about the running of the kickoffs from our point of view. They really value the importance of the agenda preparation, because then we really shape the kickoff on the benefit of the 2 main parties, you know, the CHMP rapporteur and the assessors team, and then the industry. And really that the kickoff has facilitated massively interactions across committees at the EMEA. By having the different chairs of members of other committees, we have been able to flag issues that go beyond the traditional way of looking at the product. We have been able to identify issues that affect a pediatric population and really think about that PIP that was ongoing that way, maybe was not fitting in terms of timelines, the proposed development by the company. And then we have taken this offline and we have tried to work on that. So that's really quite a proactive approach to that. The timing of the eligibility, of course, is critical for a full engagement from all of us. So we always mention that the kickoff meeting is a very, I would say, a milestone, but then we need the scientific advice to follow up on the individual topics that are identified there. And again, we recognize that maybe we need to really to improve the follow-up communications and updates on the development of the product, something that will be coming to you in the future. I've been talking about scientific advice a bit, and here is basically a description, high level, and without information about the products, but what we have already seen as support on Prime products. So of 7 products that have been around scientific advice, we have had already 11 requests on scientific advice following the kickoff meetings. I think that signals the benefit of that discussion. Of course, I don't have I would say, a parallel group to compare what would have happened with those products if we wouldn't have a kickoff. But I think, from following the discussion, that many issues were, in fact, new, even for the developers sometimes. We have covered quite a broad range of aspects when we have discussed this product in scientific advice. And as you can see there, we put quality, non-clinical, and clinical. I'm not myself a quality person, but I think many people will share with me that quality has been really, advices in the quality area have been really an eye-opener for all of us. I mean, at least for me, it was a surprise that was a topic so predominant at the kickoff. And that, I think, also speaks about the benefit of having an early dialogue, because we cannot really have issues on quality for an accredited assessment. So that is a no-go area, I would say. So that really highlights the importance of that. We have been trying to be as flexible as possible with the scientific advices after, and thanks to the input from the men sitting at my left-hand side, you can see that they have even had shorter pre-submission periods, and 3 advices have been adopted in 40 days. That's a record. And you have to really to value the effort from the assessors working on that. Not only that, but you have also to take into account that once the product is in the system, the next advice builds on the previous knowledge. And we are keeping the coordinator for those scientific advices throughout the development up to marketing authorization. Again, a benefit that is maybe not obvious in a slide, but is there in terms of coordination. That's and then finally, in terms of multi-stakeholder involvement, well, this is, I'm not sure if it's a disappointment. Maybe it's too early. We have been trying to do our best. We have had so far 1 EMEA HTA parallel advice with patients involved in 2 cases. In terms of involvement of patients, that is a regular, I would say, feature of the scientific advices for orphans, for other products, and for Prime, we always put them there. We would like to improve in terms of engagement with HTAs. There's a lot of work in parallel on that, so I think that is going to improve in the future. But again, that's an area for further development that we need to follow closer. But it's not only that. We have also other interactions with applicants. We address direct queries, so we are happy to receive questions from applicants after the eligibility, and in fact, Zara is looking at that routinely, and we then distribute the queries to the relevant colleagues, either in the network or at the agency. We have had a number of ad hoc teleconference meetings with rapporteurs and the MEA with the company, so that's possible. So before we were asking about interaction flexibility, that we have done. Sometimes we have identified the issues, sometimes has been coming from industry, but we are happy to take this request on board. And again, as I said before, maybe an area for improvement would be really to have these regular updates on the development and really revise the milestones that we have discussed at the level of the kickoff. And that's a wish that we have. And there's also, I think, a responsibility that we have to really follow up the project that we put in the system, given the resources that we are investing on that. So just to finish, we believe that the kickoff is really an excellent opportunity to initiate an interaction and flag issues. And we have in drafting guidance on the kickoff meeting in order to clarify to the sponsors what is the point of the kickoff meeting and how to better prepare for that. The rapporteur appointment definitely enables early identification of potential issues and really is a gain in terms of knowledge transfer, knowledge gain from the system. I would say that the collaboration with committees is really excellent. I mean, we have here the chairs of the different scientific committees. You can contradict me later, but I think that from what I've seen has been really a great achievement. We have the possibility to have iterative scientific advices, and we have the opportunity to have a multi-stakeholder involvement. We need to put more emphasis on that to improve this communication, and that takes shape. And finally, last point, which is the last, but I would say not least, something that we recently also were discussing. It's rather interesting how having the kickoffs, having the different senior people from the network involved in these early discussions also triggers among us discussions at the level of product type, product class, beyond that product that is in the eligibility. Just to give an example, and without disclosing anything, recently we were discussing about viral vectors for an ATMP beyond that individual product. And these are discussions that I'm sure we'll be having, as we gain experience, because the kickoff exposes you also to the development of that product and to the regulatory challenge that development, that specific product brings to us. And I think it's a very good also trigger for us to reflect on the future. So that would be it. I wanted to keep it short, so thank you.
That's great, Jordi. Thanks a lot. Sarah, I understand this was something you produced together. Something you want to add?
No, I think Jordi summarized very well. We have identified areas for improvement, but overall, this is the feedback we've had so far on the 15 meetings we've organized with companies.
Okay, so that summarizes the experience, that the way we perceive it. As mentioned before, we now have two candidates or two presentations that will reflect individual company experience, and Dr. Sproule and Dr. Kennard will provide their views from Kite Pharma and from Biogen on the experience with the kickoff, and later on Dr. Bennett will give the summarizing the response that EFPIA has collected. But Rizwana, do you want to go first, I hope?
Yes.
Yes, good. And thanks for doing this.
You're welcome.
Very nice.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting us to the Prime anniversary, first anniversary for Prime. My name is Rizwana Sproule. I'm at Kite Pharma, and we've been developing a ATMP called KTC19. And I want to also acknowledge that this Prime experience has been great for the company, and we have used our regulatory consultants here at Diamond Biopharm Limited, who helped us with this new innovative process to try and go through it. But before I start, I just wanted to give you a little background to the product that we are developing. It is an autologous chimeric antigen receptor T-cell therapy with a CD3, CD28-based signaling that recognizes and eliminates CD19 expressing cells on normal and malignant cells, as described in that picture on the right. The process involves taking the white blood cells out of patients by a process called apheresis, isolating and activating the T cells. They are then engineered to express the chimeric antigen receptor, and then they are allowed to grow and expand, formulated, frozen, and then returned back to the clinical site to be infused back into the patients. So this is a novel personalized immunotherapy that has been developed by Kite Pharma, and again, I think this lends itself to one of why we received Prime designation, because of its novelty and potential clinical benefit that it could provide. So we were eligible for Prime. We met the unmet medical need. We had preliminary clinical evidence, and we had the potential to bring a major therapeutic advantage to patients. we were a bit later in stage of development, so I think we met a lot of the criteria probably early on that are maybe not eligible now, but I think because of the novelty of the product, we were given prime. So the benefits, as Jordi said, the early appointment of the rapporteur was critical. As you know, in the US, we have the review team already assigned to us from the beginning, and the EU, we only get to see the rapporteur 6 months before we file the MA. So this is critical for us to have this opportunity to interact with the rapporteur. We had a kick-off meeting that provided guidance on the development plan and regulatory strategy and early review of eligibility for accelerated assessment. And most importantly, we felt this really helped us was the dedicated contact person at EMEA. And, this was really key for us to move forward on this new process, to understand what was needed. We got really good feedback from Zara as our contact person. And then the additional support from EMA and SOAP and the scientific committees at the kickoff meeting was also very critical for them to understand our product and bring up any issues that might be coming up. So the condition we got prime was for KT-90 was in diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, and this is a subtype of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, a very aggressive subtype, aggressive form of B-cell non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in adults, where the outcomes are very, very poor, and there are no therapies approved in this setting. These patients have no curative options, and there is a clear unmet medical need. And the KTC-19 is being developed as an option for patients with highly chemotherapy refractory lymphoma. And we are also developing it in not only DLBCL, but also PMBCL and TFL. So coming on to the experience, like I said, we were later in our pivotal phase 2 study, so we had been for scientific advice, that sought scientific advice prior to obtaining prime. And so being the first oncology product to receive prime status, we were very also unsure of what to expect with this new process. Here, the prime EMA coordinator was very helpful. She advised us on what was needed for the prime kickoff meeting and what to provide in the briefing document. The kickoff agenda, as Jordi said, was largely driven by the prime team, and discussions were at the top level. But knowing that the rapporteur, our rapporteur early was a positive factor, and we did have a lot of discussions with the rapporteur at the meeting. And again, the discussions were orientated towards the accelerated assessment, which is what is underpinning the prime eligibility to enable us to go for accelerated assessment. So feedback that we had, there was a high reliance on following scientific advice and protocol assistant procedure. That is the process in Europe. This could, for somebody like us at a late stage, this could impact our timelines and may, impact the EMA submission for expediting development. We felt that maybe a different focus would be needed for late-stage products that had been given prime eligibility. Maybe there would be some more sort of follow-up with the rapporteur on certain elements or follow-up meetings. So I think maybe one point would be to consider for late stage that there'd be a different process to early stage products. And then the key concerns highlighted by the rapporteur and some top-level advice provided at the kickoff meeting would be beneficial. So maybe some feedback on the briefing document would have been helpful for us to prepare for the meeting and maybe have a more fruitful discussion at the kickoff meeting. And then since we only had one kickoff meeting, maybe some follow-up meetings might have been also helpful to keep us on, to ensure that we were on the right track for either accelerated assessment or, what's expected for the MAA. And then I think I said this many times, maybe have opportunities for direct interactions with the rapporteur, maybe some teleconferences on non-significant issues that would need to be going through the CHMP, and here the MEA coordinator to facilitate these types of proposed interactions. But all in all, it's been very helpful to have that early interaction, to get the rapporteurs engaged and the CHMP to understand this complex area of CAR T cell therapy, which is novel, so that there's no sort of challenges, hopefully, down the road as we move towards approval.
Thanks a lot. That's very clear. I suggest that we come back to comment specific comments later on as well to this one, but very clear. Thanks. James, a different disease area.
Yes. Thank you. While we're waiting for the slides, I'll just say thank you for the opportunity to speak. Yeah, different disease area. So let me move on, standard piece there. In terms of some background, aducanumab is the product that is our experience with the PRIME scheme in Alzheimer's disease. It's a monoclonal antibody. We first had sort of initial discussions through previous scientific advice and also being asked back to the EMA to discuss the disease area around the PRIME scheme and the benefits that it may provide to a product such as ours in Alzheimer's disease. When we entered into those initial discussions, we were at the later stages, similar to Rizwana, of development. We were initiating our phase 3 program. But I think when you look at Alzheimer's and the fact that it is a huge unmet medical need, you have to consider the societal sort of benefit and also the health systems and how they're going to deal with that. So we saw real value in ensuring that we could have these initial discussions and ensure that we could get this multi-stakeholder advice as well. We prepared for the PRIME scheme in advance of its launch, obviously in line with the guidance on the eligibility in terms of addressing the potential to address that unmet medical need and also the extremely large potential benefit there. In terms of just some timelines there, we were accepted as per the guidance in May of last year, and the rapporteur was assigned the following month at the CHMP meeting in June. We had our kickoff meeting in September. I think, as was pointed out earlier, there's very much some flexibility there. Sorry.
Yes, and I appreciate you, but you have to look at the microphone.
The EMA were very open to schedule very quickly, so we really appreciated that. The post-meeting EMA dialogue as well was extremely constructive. So again, any sort of informal discussions we've had with Zara have been phenomenally beneficial. We are at the moment investigating our first formal engagement following the PRIME scheme acceptance as well. So in terms of our experiences so far, in terms of the kickoff meeting and the briefing package, again, I'm going to reiterate this, but the discussions with the EMA on how to approach this and what to prepare for this was vital. We wanted to ensure that we were tailoring the package in relation to our future topics for engagement, and felt that one of the, it may be a minor point, but we found of real value was to tabulate all of the assessments for our future discussions with the stakeholders, but also really illustrating which stakeholders we wanted involved at which different type of topic and when in the timeline we would like to do that. We did, of course, try to include substantial background for each of the topics that we wanted to discuss going forwards. In terms of preparation for the actual kickoff meeting, I can't stress enough the importance of the dedicated support. What that really did was help manage our internal expectations of what to expect, but also give us an understanding of what was expected of us in that meeting and how best to prepare for that meeting. We certainly approached it from a multidisciplinary fashion. So we wanted to ensure that we were covering all aspects of our development program. So not just the clinical, but also the non-clinical and the quality. That was of real importance to us. Again, really to try and help ensure we could potentially move to a successful accelerated process. The agenda, again, it may not seem as important when you first think about it, but it is, because what you receive is an idea of what are the concerns and issues that the regulators and the stakeholders have with a certain product. But what it also allows us to do is ensure that we can hone in on those areas during the meeting to get the most out of the discussions, especially having the rapporteur assigned early and their involvement in reviewing our package prior to the meeting gave us an extremely good idea of what the concerns may be. Obviously, we're able to structure our presentation based upon the agenda. And I would say it was a change to normal preparation internally for a meeting with the regulators. We knew that we weren't going to get into an in-depth scientific discussion, which was just a different take really on how you'd normally prepare for this type of meeting, but it was a welcome change to tack. So in terms of the actual kick-off meeting, we had our meeting in September, as I mentioned. It was clear the rapporteurs team was extremely well prepared. They'd done an awful lot of background research and obviously read in detail our package to support this. So the context for the meeting really was to obtain feedback and to facilitate a smooth regulatory pathway. It was clear from the kick-off meeting that the preferred option for formal scientific advice through the centralised process, and there was a high value put on multi-stakeholder scientific advice. Something obviously we wanted to ensure that we were able to discuss during the kick-off meeting. As mentioned before, there is obviously the proposal to utilise a shorter lead-in time to the scientific advice, which I can assure you is certainly an advantage. And I'll come on to this in a minute, but again, this has been raised previously, that the post-authorisation plans are key. What it really enabled us to do was ensure that we're taking a holistic view on product development and not just concentrating on what we can do to get this product to market, but what we can do once we have the product on the market to ensure we're capturing the relevant data to answer those unanswered questions and ensure that patient access is really tackled not just from the initial point of approval, but later on into the life cycle of the product. And also the recognition of the need for HTA engagement in that multi-stakeholder setting. So just to build a little bit around our key outcomes, I think obviously the agreement on a shorter scientific advice procedure, but also given the very busy schedule to get on the books as soon as possible. I think what was interesting, and again this sort of talks to the dialogue with the EMA outside of the formal interactions, is when you're looking at, for example, parallel scientific advice, you may want to consider the full time frame. I think where you may have already had previous scientific advice, whether that's centralised or national, you may not have had the same level of discussion with the HTA bodies. So really to ensure the HTA bodies have enough time to be fully familiar with the product and also the strategy therein and have the ability to input into that, I think that there's value in taking the full time frame there. As I mentioned before, post-authorization strategy, absolutely key. I think reassurance there is needed, whether that is in terms of if you're looking at a disease continuum such as Alzheimer's disease, and maybe focusing on a certain aspect of that disease continuum to ensure that you can at least look at other areas of that disease area. That's certainly very important. And again, talking to the multi-stakeholder advice, I think not just from an HTA perspective, there may be a prior advocacy piece that's needed to really try and enter into initial discussions with the HTA bodies before you even get into that centralised advice procedure could be beneficial. Again, another very important aspect for us was to ensure that we got the right patient advocacy involvement in these discussions. Obviously, single patient view is extremely important, but we want to ensure that we're getting a disease sort of patient community consistent a view into our advice as well. So I know there is already a mechanism for this, but we want to ensure that we're making the most constructive views and able to hear the patient's views in these types of interactions as well. So just some observations on potential improvements. I know the EMA are not going to agree to these off the bat, so. Absolutely clear from the kick-off meeting that the rapporteur's role is to discuss the development program with the applicant and identify potentially areas that need to be raised to centralise advice. I think what's key to us is it's important to maintain the option of informal discussions with the rapporteur. So not everything has to go through centralised advice. It's the ability to ensure that we can have those informal telecons and meetings with the rapporteur leading up to centralised advice, but throughout the development of a programme. So again, although centralised advice is preferred, take a product that's late in development, such as Rizwana's and ours, you will have had either centralised or national scientific advice, and quite often we do balance those two types of advice depending upon the area or the topic for discussion. And quite often you may find that a national agency offers specific advice in a specific area. I think what was clear from the meeting, it may not always be possible to continue that national advice. And I can understand the benefits and reasons as to why, but I think that needs to be made clear to potential applicants as to the change in the way in which you approach scientific advice off the back of being accepted into the PRIME scheme. But it is important that national expertise in specific areas can be included in future engagement, whether that's with the rapporteur involved in addition to other national agencies in individual discussions, including that which has been previously sought. And my final slide, really a couple of points. I think this certainly has been mentioned previously. Periodic update meetings would be extremely useful with the EMA and the rapporteur, really to check in on progress and where things may have changed in your development, as is always the case. I think that's especially important earlier in development when engagement may be less frequent rather than later in development when you may have already gone through a number of iterations of engagement already. And this is a minor point. I think really the guidance on the application is very clear and for the kick-off meeting and is very straightforward to follow. I think one of the challenges we had with the kick-off meeting briefing package was, on the one hand, the guidance advisors a short and focused package. However, when you look at the topics to be included, it is extremely long and very substantial. So it's balancing that, I think, but more an observation than anything else. But thank you.
Excellent, James. Thank you to you as well for raising some very good points. And without going into detail, I think I welcome your example, because it goes back to what Jordi said, that sometimes the development is such a late stage that we don't expect much of a discussion on the clinical data that will be generated for the first approval. But in this case, you highlighted the importance of quality and manufacturing, and that was clearly something, as Jordi said, that was something we picked up, but we thought that if we have a clinical package but no supply, what's the value? But equally, perhaps even more important, the post-approval development in an area where, of course, we understand that the first data that we would have would only give us some evidence, and we will certainly need to follow it up from an efficacy, safety, June point of view, and also, of course, the importance from the FDA perspective. So all these aspects were very welcome. Just as a note to the chairs for the discussion later on, Jordi and Rob, I think we should take up that point about interaction with rapporteurs that you raised. That's been a very tricky one for us because we haven't really, we need to learn how we should actually fine-tune the access to rapporteurs versus taking everything through EMA, etc. But also your other point about updates. We welcome regular updates, and that goes both ways. We welcome when you inform us about the good news, but we expect you actually to inform us about the bad news, and we don't want to read in the papers about an adverse event or something in a PRIME. That puts us in a difficult position. So the updates actually works both ways. So let's come back to all that. Simon, you're going to do something similar to what Ahmad did earlier on eligibility. You're going to talk about the industry collected some joint experience on the kickoffs.
Certainly. Thanks, Thomas. So I'm Simon Bennett. I work for Biogen, but I'm here representing EFPIA today. And this presentation, similar to the presentation that Ahmad gave in the eligibility session, is a joint industry presentation looking at the support to prime medicines. And I think just one observation as we sort of introduce the topic. As we talk about a one-year anniversary, I was reminded of all the children's first birthday parties I've ever been to, where the event is much more significant for the parents than the child itself. And I think I just raise that because our experience with the support for Prime so far is fairly limited. So I think that will build over time. So if we move on, so as Ahmad's already presented this in his presentation. So these are the industry associations involved in this supporting this presentation here. So just to remind everyone, the basis of this presentation is formed from a survey that was conducted by industry. As Ahmed explained, this survey was initially put out in April 2016. It was then expanded to include questions around the kick-off meeting and industry's overall experience with support within the Prime scheme, and was redone in May 2017. And the results of this survey form the basis of this presentation. And I have to acknowledge the work that a couple of people in particular, Nadej LaRue and Fiona Riki from the EFPIA group, did in driving the responses to this survey. As you'll see, we had 8 responses which provided feedback on the kick-off meeting and the support they'd received. This number is obviously lower than those in the eligibility presentation, just simply because of the number of products that are actually in the Prime scheme is only 20. If we look at the kick-off meeting and the response to the support provided through the kick-off meeting, the results for the survey are summarised on this slide. We had, although we had 8 respondents, we had 5 companies that had actually been through a kick-off meeting within the Prime scheme. I have to say at the start that the feedback generally on all the questions that we asked was generally very positive. As you can see from the figures there, of the 5 companies that had been through kick-off meetings, all had received guidance about the content, preparation and topics for the kick-off meeting in advance. All of them agreed that the assignment of a dedicated EMA contact was beneficial to the overall process, and all confirmed that the rapporteur was assigned shortly after entry into the Prime scheme. So the experience of industry in that respect matches the promise that Prime put forward initially. In terms of the guidance for the kick-off meeting, I think generally that was found to be helpful, although there's only 3 out of 5 indicated it was. A 4th respondent indicated that it had very good support and just didn't tick the yes box. One point that we want to highlight on this slide is in the final line of the table, which is a question around whether, following the assignment of the rapporteur, whether there's the opportunity for a continued informal dialogue with the rapporteur or other national agencies outside of the centralised advice procedure. And as you'll see there, 2 respondents out of the 5 indicated there was, and 3 indicated there wasn't. And this goes to some of the comments that have been raised in some of the previous presentations around the ability to continue a dialogue with the rapporteur informally is felt to be important within the Prime scheme, really to highlight those issues that might need further scientific advice and those that don't need to go for centralised scientific advice. If we move on to aspects of support during the kick-off meeting, respondents were asked what their expectations were before they went to the kick-off meeting, and they're listed there on the right-hand side in the top line. So certainly those respondents from industry who filled the survey in expected to meet with the rapporteur. They expected to have the opportunity to present their products and the development pathway, either planned or that had been completed to date. They expected to have a discussion on strategic key questions. They also expected to be able to have a discussion about when and how to go for scientific advice in the future, and that's linked to the milestone definition and scenario planning. And I think it's fair to say that the response, again, was fairly positive in terms of those expectations being met. The comment there at the bottom, again, relates back to the ability to have informal meetings with the rapporteur outside of a scientific advice procedures being important to that particular respondent. In all cases, the recommendations that came out of the kick-off meeting were feasible and realistic. And in the bottom line below that, the impact on product development, it did lead to changes, or certainly from the industry side, it led to different considerations for the product and development and the strategy, and those are listed there, and they include some of the points already raised, the consideration around a strategy to develop using real-world data, the potential for an accelerated registration path, and aspects of protocol design. This next slide just summarises some of the comments that we had collected through the survey in terms of what the most useful elements of the kick-off meeting were from industry's perspective. The participants or the attendees at the meeting was very useful. The fact that you had the rapporteur's assessment team there, representation by EMA senior figures who brought a high level of knowledge and expertise to the meeting, And the fact that it was a multidisciplinary meeting with a broad spread of experts was seen as a very useful element from industry's perspective. The feedback from the meeting itself was also seen as very useful, which is reassuring, certainly around the comments around the broad advice that you got from the meeting on procedural, legal, scientific issues related to the dossier. The fact that potential issues could be flagged and resolved prior to filing, or at least discussed within the kick-off meeting, was welcomed. There was also comments that the SME office supporting this and assessing early eligibility was appreciated, and that really falls into the eligibility piece. And the fact that it was a quick interactive procedure, again, was welcomed by industry. And that final point around the informal dialogue, I think the feedback was that those companies that engaged in the kick-off meetings felt it was a very open, frank, and very useful discussion. Some of the key learnings that were highlighted in the survey are listed here. Not surprisingly, logistics around the fact that the meeting's very resource-intensive, intense preparation, is something that was highlighted, and in particular where we've seen feedback from perhaps the SMEs where there's not just going through Prime, but they're perhaps going through other accelerated procedures in other jurisdictions. Then there was certainly a pressure on the workforce there. There was comments that the meeting was not long enough to cover all the aspects that the companies wanted to cover. So I think 2 hours was a typical duration, and there was a feeling that could perhaps be extended. And there was also a comment that in some cases not all the relevant stakeholders were present, and I think this specifically referred to the possibility for the EMA inspectorate to attend these meetings when there's questions around GMP or to discuss GMP issues. In terms of key learnings that came out from the discussion on the kick-off meeting, companies came out and felt there was a greater understanding of the rapporteur and the CHMP expectations. They felt the dialogue was very relevant, which is reassuring, especially in the case of innovative products where there's little existing knowledge. The dedication of the EMA and the rapporteur and their assessment team to look for solutions or potential to be able to put products through a potentially accelerated registration pathway and look at creative ways of doing that was appreciated. And then the fact that this kick-off meeting offers the opportunity for a broad dialogue rather than specific scientific advice questions, which are held obviously through a different procedure, was seen as beneficial to industry as a whole. Just moving on, although we don't have much experience in the broad support within the Prime scheme, just some key points to highlight here. The timetable was followed in all cases. The interactions with the EMA team were seen as being very useful. And on the question of whether there were plans to include additional stakeholders during scientific advice within Prime, there was a reply that the HTA and the WHO were, and I think that's already been covered in a previous presentation. If we move on to proposals for improvement that came out of the survey, so specifically related to the kick-off meeting, the time for discussion, I think we've already talked about this. If the meeting could be extended to cover all items of development, that would potentially be appreciated. Flexibility around the meeting date was also highlighted, so rather than bookending it around the CHMP week, whether there was some more flexibility in the timing, and then also the location, rather than necessarily having to be at the EMA or the National Agency of the Rapporteur, where there was the flexibility to have it in a third location. The timelines for the availability of the final minutes was highlighted, so I think industry commit to get minutes of the meeting back to the agency within 2 weeks, but then I think the timeline for finalising the minutes is open-ended, and it was felt that it would be good to put something around that. And then also the possibility of a follow-up or a clarification meeting. This goes to again, it's linked to the time for discussion, whether there's the opportunity to have that follow-up meeting would be useful in some cases. In terms of regulatory interactions, some respondents felt that some additional support to define the planned frequency and timing for EMA and rapporteur interactions in the future would have been helpful or would be helpful. And then to further to some of the points that have already been raised in some of the other presentations, the flexibility for national scientific advice interactions where appropriate. So in cases where there's specific expertise within the European system, respondents to the survey would like to have the opportunity to utilise that if at all possible. And then not really a proposal for improvement, but the final point on this slide, more of a question really around the transfer of knowledge within the EMA. So obviously within Prime, the EMA staff become very close to the product and very aware of the product, and it's just a question about how that knowledge gets transferred within the EMA once the product moves out of the Prime scheme and into the typical post-marketing phase. This is the final slide. These results, these suggestions for further suggestions for consideration rather than improvement probably, really are highlighted here partly to stimulate discussion during the panel session later after the coffee break. And some of these people will have seen before as part of the, which were communicated during the development of the Prime scheme. The first point is around a request to open up Prime eligibility for irrespective of the size of the company. So this goes to the ability to enter the Prime scheme at the proof of principle stage. Secondly, the possibility to open the Prime scheme for products already licensed, so already marketed products that could address unmet needs, but through new indications, acknowledging that the current legislation might not permit us to do that. Flexible scientific advice tailored to the Prime scheme, although industry really appreciates the fact that, as Jordi highlighted, there's been 3 cases where you've followed a 40-day process for scientific advice. There's a question about whether we could make it even more rapid within the Prime scheme. Going to the point that was raised at the end of the eligibility session, industry is looking for a stronger link between Prime scheme and the involvement of HTA bodies in the early discussions. So to Wim's point, I think there is a desire from industry to move in that direction. And then finally, a question on whether within the Prime scheme, given the requirements for entering the Prime scheme, whether automatic accelerated assessment for a product that's in the Prime scheme would be optional rather than really having to go through an assessment for accelerated assessment once you're in Prime. So, as I say, these are suggestions for consideration, for discussion, probably in the panel session later today.
Excellent, Simon. And as you clearly indicated, some of these we've discussed before, and I will probably disappoint you by saying that some of these opening up and etc. we probably think is too early. We've said that we will assess that also in terms of resources, in terms of opening up for indications, etc. But I think we're probably a bit too early for that at this stage. But thanks for all those points, and I hope the chairs for the 2 sessions will note them down. I'll now hand over to Jordi to chair the first discussions or question and answer session from this particular focus on kickoffs. Then we have a short coffee break, and then we go for the so-called panel discussion. I think panel discussion, I hope this is really when we can get all the interactions from everyone in the room, right, Jordi?
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. Definitely for the panel discussion, what we'll do, we'll have, in fact, some slides to really trigger some topics to facilitate the discussion, but then it's for all of us to really discuss about the different topics that we have been discussing today. So the floor is open for questions. So yes, please.
Hi, this is Dennis Williams. I'm with Adaptimmune. We work in the oncology space, ATMPs, and I represent one of the ATMPs that have one of the 6 oncology products that have received Prime. I was wondering if maybe, Jordi, you could speak a little bit to the interaction between the rapporteurs and scientific advice. So I'm one of the products that we had our kickoff meeting in December, and we've embarked on 2 scientific advice procedures, one which will conclude this week at CHMP. And I'm just trying to get a sense, it's not entirely obvious to me what the interaction is between the rapporteurs and scientific advice. Now, clearly I can see that someone from the RAPS team is a coordinator for the advice, but it's still, maybe if you can just speak to that a little bit, that would be useful.
Yeah, maybe Rob, you can address.
Yeah, so as you observe, for all of the rapporteur appointments so far, either the rapporteur personally or representatives from their agency, so people with whom they work closely, are members of the Scientific Advice Party, Working Party, and that creates a bridge. So the aim of appointing the coordinators consistently in the Scientific Advice Working Party is to create a bridge to the rapporteur in person and perhaps more importantly the bridge to the rapporteur's assessment team. And then you'll have a second coordinator from the scientific advice that comes from another member state or another agency. One thing that perhaps wasn't explicit in Jordi's presentation, for all of the scientific advice discussions that we have on a product in the Prime scheme, it will be discussed in the plenary session of the relevant committee, and certainly we bring all of them to the discussion at the CHMP. And the rapporteur is then in the room in person, fully prepared, having participated in the scientific advice interactions and read the draft report. So the rapporteur is fully up to speed. But also then the rest of the CHMP sees all of the developments that come through the Prime scheme. And I think that's part of this issue of how do you keep the rest of the system and the future co-rapporteur up to speed, because all of these discussions come back to the CHMP plenary.
Thank you, Rob. Yeah.
I think to go back to your questions as well, within EMA of transfer of knowledge, this is something we've put in place by transferring the information of what has happened to the product during development and all the scientific advices, and then organizing meetings with members of the product team that will then subsequently work, and that the company will meet during the pre-submission meetings and then work through the EMA.
Just to clarify, also to add on that, I mean, we are a less rigid organization than it may seem from the outside, because many of the, because many of the colleagues that are assessing eligibility will be in the future EPLs, for instance, or PMs of those applications. So we don't have a lot of resources, although we are very committed, so we have used a matrix approach to the assessment of those applications. So unless even that's not transparent to you, that needs to be understood. So there's a lot of information around on Prime products. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Laura Savini with the European Hemophilia Consortium. In your presentation, you mentioned something regarding PIP requirements with ATMPs, and I'm wondering, how do you evaluate or how do you assess PIP requirements for some curative therapies like gene therapy when there are other therapeutic options in the treatment area you're looking at?
I think I need to deflect the question, I guess, to the chairman of the PDCO or even to Martina. Dirk, thank you.
Thanks, Jordi. Jordi, clearly the Prime is not exempting you from the pediatric regulation. So, and coming back to one of the first slides, we saw that approximately 60 to 70% are in phase 1, end phase 1, beginning phase 2. If you look at the regulation, you actually should have either a waiver or a PIP. This being said, of course, we understand that this is not always possible. Still, you will, in case you are at Prime, you will get the reminder if you don't have yet contacted the PDCO. You have seen that the PDCO is, PDCO always nominates a member to join the kickoff meeting, so to make sure that the information transfer is there. And of course, we are working as a team here in the network to make sure that the right questions are already addressed at the kickoff meeting. We may address to you as a PDCO with a PIP, but you have to have a waiver or a PIP with the Prime procedure at one stage. And it's advisable to have it as early enough.
There's obviously some specific considerations for each therapeutic area. So you mentioned the haemophilia in the context of gene therapies and already approved products. And of course, we could spend a lot of time going into the specifics, but that's not the purpose of today. I think from a general point of view of the scheme and the interactions, I think this is exactly where the representation from the chair of the advanced therapies, the chair of the PDCO, should be helpful to the sponsors, because those can be difficult conversations, and in principle, the earlier you start those conversations, the better you can plan.
So just to clarify, I'm a patient representative. We do not develop any treatment.
Sure, I was not speaking to you alone. I was speaking to everyone in the room.
Thank you.
Hello, my name's Carl Graham Sigetaler, and I'm from Hoffman La Roche. And given the comments, I mean, throughout all the presentations, there's been a lot of focus on the importance of the rapporteurs in the PRIME procedure, which is not surprising with early appointments, and the importance of continuing ongoing interaction. So one of the questions I think I'd like to hear a comment on is, are we doing anything different in terms of assignment of rapporteurs to the PRIME, the products receiving PRIME designation? Are we doing anything, given that a lot of these are going to be in innovation areas? So are we looking at expertise in any different way than we do currently with appointment of rapporteurs?
Well, I hope you are not referring only to the time of the appointment of the rapporteur, which that should be clear, that is much earlier than would be regularly for a non-prime product. But in terms of the I would say the focus of the rapporteur on the expertise needed for that product. So what we try to identify, we identify the time of the appointment is the best expertise available in the network. And that's done for prime. So at that point in time, you have an understanding of what the product is about, what's the development, and then you would, the CTMP would identify what's the best, I would say, place in the network to deal with that application from that early stage of development.
Yeah, that answered it. As long as, so the focus is on the scientific expertise. It's just because there's fairly limited information available in a 30-page application and the appointment really before any kind of detailed discussion. So, but it is intended to be scientific expertise that would make the decision. Thank you.
Yes. I haven't invited before the chairs of the committees to comment, because we have been talking about your interaction on kickoffs and multidisciplinary approach, but I mean, feel free if you want to participate on this aspect. Yeah, of course.
Well, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm June Rain from the Pharmacovigilance Risk Assessment Committee, and I've been really pleased to hear from the talk so far of the growing recognition of the importance of early dialogue to plan ahead for the post-authorization data generation. And I hope we will come back to that. But my question, in relation to the examples we've had today, and thank you very much indeed for them, we've seen two very different scenarios for planning for post-authorization monitoring of benefit risk. And I'd like to ask the speakers if you have any recommendations for the guidance you're given that I can take away, given that we heard from Professor Razi at the beginning how we're looking at coming together as a network, engaging early and using the old tools really as well as we can. And I think the interesting dimension for PRAC is moving towards some new tools, better use of real-world data, for example. So are you getting sufficient advice through the guidance, through the kick-off, etc.? So over to you, please.
Thank you. Yeah, I would say the guidance we're getting in the kick-off is probably the primary point at which it is of most benefit, because although we recognise the need for it, to hear it reiterated, I think, does have a huge impact internally within the organisation as to the importance of it. I think we haven't yet got to the point where we're having individual scientific advice on specifics yet, so I can't comment on that. But there are a number of other sort of forums or initiatives, especially with real-world evidence, where I think our initial interactions will pay huge dividends. But until we have those points, I think the benefits are to be seen. So,
thank you. Yes, please, over there.
Hi, it's Steve Hall here from Pfizer. We've not yet had our kickoff meeting, but we would like to see the kickoff meeting as the start of an interaction process, not the only interaction process. So it was good to hear the discussion that rapporteurs are open to some discussion, at least informally, about further interaction after the kickoff meeting. But I'm wondering, has there been any discussion to kind of more formalise that arrangement to do follow-on meetings after the kickoff meeting? Is perhaps guidance in development or some thinking around some more formal processes at EMA level?
So far, we are approaching this on a case by case. I know that's an awful term to use here, but we have been trying to look at that. First, the main interaction that we understand is the scientific advice procedure for the topics that we have identified. We are happy to have interactions in parallel, not obviously on scientific advice matters, I would say. And we have done that. We have done that in cases of safety issues or any feedback that we have had from sponsors. That's possible, but we don't feel that we can really structure this, at least now. We have not enough experience, but we are open to that, definitely. And on that, you can count on us that we will involve the most relevant, I would say, partners that we have here, either members of committees or, other stakeholders that are needed for that. I guess what we will develop this later is when we have what we were also today saying that we need this more structured follow-up on development, because the kickoff is okay, as you said, is a start of an interaction. That's what is called kickoff, and basically from there we need really to flag what do we want to discuss and how basically we go ahead discussing those ones. So I think if we develop a better interaction in terms of follow-up, we'll be able then to establish this. But again, I think we need to tailor it according to the needs of the product.
I think it's also fair to say, to give a little bit of history, and we'll come back to this topic explicitly in the discussion later. So consider this a kick-off for the discussion. But obviously we were a little bit prudent when initiating the scheme, and I can see Andrea and Jan and Bruno sat in the room here as potential CHMP rapporteurs, and how many products could they have under the Prime banner once we're at steady state? I don't know, 6, 8, 10, 12, I don't know, but a number of products. To have a carte blanche and to start with a policy that says that the company is free to interact with the rapporteur at any time, here's the telephone number, just could be unworkable. Just could be absolutely unworkable. So we established the central contact point, and if the company does desire an interaction that doesn't seem to require the formal scientific advice, then there's a possibility, but it's managed in a way. Now, also, you've heard that the aim of the scheme is to engage early in development, and the type of discussion that we should be having early in development is on the regulatory strategy and the sort of big ticket scientific questions. That's much more amenable to the scientific advice process, and it's important that those big ticket discussions are conducted through the scientific advice process with the buy-in from the committees and not only from the rapporteur team. But over time, you can imagine transitioning from that type of scientific advice into more pre-submission type activities when the interactions between the sponsor and the individual rapporteur and their team are more important. So you can imagine a transition in the type of interactions that you have over time. Now, I absolutely agree with Jordi. It's case by case, because some come in later, some products come in later, some products come in earlier. But I think that's an overall model for interaction that you can have in your minds when we discuss later and sort of critique and comment on that.